Hey guys, let's talk a little bit more about troubadours. We spent the last couple of days covering the music of the medieval church since that was a really big part of life during that time. However, the secular music, the songs of the troubadours, was a big part of their lives too, so that deserves a little bit of our time. If you are reading along with me, you can take a look at the page that says more about troubadours. I will be pulling the information from there. Troubadours during the Middle Ages in Europe were colorfully dressed musicians who traveled from village to village. They sang songs and carried the news of the day with them on their travels. So it wasn't just entertainment, it really was. They would go from one town to the next, and they had, the factual news, and then they also had the fake news. They had the gossip, they had all the good stuff, and people were eager to hear what they had to say. And back in those days, obviously, no phones, no televisions, no computers. This was the way that they got their information. They were nearly always warmly welcomed by the village leaders and the village people. Troubadours were a little bit different than other musicians in that not all of their music or poetry was religious, and some of it was unusual because they sang about real people, love stories, and heroes. Troubadours performed for nobles at feasts and for everyone at tournaments and festivals. Troubadours often had other men along with them to help entertain with dances and stunts, and these men were called, it says in here, jugglers. We talked about how they were called jongleurs in the other packet, but that's basically the same thing. If you can think in your mind about like a court jester with kind of the funny hat and sort of doing acrobatic stuff, that gives you the right idea. Troubadours sang songs of great battles and songs of beautiful ladies. They sang historical songs, some very long ones, and the heroes always won in these songs, and the bad guys always got their just punishment. So it was very satisfying to listen to these troubadour songs. Troubadours idealized knights and their quests in song, and real knights, hearing their music, wanted to be like the heroes that they heard about in the music. And so this actually promoted the rise of chivalry and manners. Always good. Since the troubadours' music was not religious, it wasn't written down. And so most of their music has actually been lost forever. But a couple of songs that they sang have made it through time and were written down after being sung or told orally for hundreds of years, which is really interesting. So still, we're not getting a super accurate impression of what the music was like, because think about what happens when a song is passed from person to person to person, even over a short period of time. And now imagine what happens if it goes person to person to person to person over hundreds of years. It's probably really different from the original. One of these, though, is the epic poem Beowulf. You may have heard of that. I'm not sure. If you haven't, you will study it, I am sure, in Mrs. Tyink's class eventually. Beowulf was spoken as a poem by some, but sung by others. And it's the story of a hero who fights and defeats a huge monster. And the other one is the Song of Roland. As the story goes, Roland was a troubadour. He was the nephew of the famous Charlemagne, who was the king of the Franks and the Holy Roman Emperor. And during medieval times, Charlemagne was a great and famous king. There were many stories and legends about Charlemagne and some of the knights who followed him. And one of the most famous stories about Charlemagne and his paladins was the Song of Roland. Roland was a paladin who went to fight the Muslims. Roland and a few other knights and soldiers were quickly surrounded by a Muslim army, and Roland had a magical horn that would call the other paladins to help him. He blew and blew the horn, but there were no knights close enough to help. Roland and his band were wiped out. But the king and other warriors had heard the horn and were rushing to help. When they got there, they found the bodies of Roland and his band. King Charlemagne was so upset that he asked the gods to help him. Then Charlemagne and the other knights and the rest of the army found the Muslim army and, in a great battle, defeated them. So all troubadours forever after carry a musical horn with them as a reminder of Roland, who is considered the most famous troubadour. So that's just a few little tidbits about troubadours and all of those different secular musicians. I hope it gives you kind of a different perspective on what medieval music could sound like. That's a lot different than the music of the church.